Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second edition of the AI Governance webinar series hosted by the Center for Intellectual Property and Information Technology Law, CIPIT, here at Strathmore University. So today's webinar session marks the first webinar series of the second edition of the AI Governance webinar series, which is titled AI Explained: Shaping Policy in Africa. We will be specifically focusing on AI governance frameworks, global and regional policy trends, and ethical AI. I know this is a discussion that we've previously had and focused on, especially for those who were with us during the first edition of the AI governance webinar series, where we had a series of webinars that we hosted touching on different elements of AI governance as well. And we culminated that by ending it in November of last year, where we had a few insights from different East African countries and different perspectives with respect to AI governance. So what makes this one slightly different? So this particular series is intending to explain AI from a governance perspective, noting that there's quite a number of changes that are continuously going on that we have noted since last year, with respect to how AI policy, AI governance is being shaped in Africa. And as is with CIPIT, we always intend to apply a multidisciplinary approach in that we look at AI not only from an African lens, but also lending it the different components that we address here at CIPIT, being intellectual property and data governance, which cross-cut against various parameters and components. So in so doing, allow me to introduce the panelists who we'll be having for today, who may be familiar to quite a number of the participants or not familiar. And if they're not, I'm sure they'll be familiar from today onwards. So allow me to introduce the panelists who are key researchers here at CIPIT. Joshua Kitili, Cynthia Nzuki, and Josephine Kaniru, as well as Irene Makau, who I will now allow to introduce themselves more substantially. So Joshua, you can go first.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Joshua Kitili. I'm a research associate here at CIPIT. Of late, I've been focusing on a project that's dealing with Kenya's cybercrime law, and it's dealing with making recommendations regarding emerging tech realities. So that's my primary focus right now. Apart from that, I work in the data governance department and also assist in AI department and IP.
Thank you so much, Joshua. Cynthia Nzuki.
Thank you so much, Florence. Good afternoon, this chilly afternoon, everyone. My name is Cynthia Nzuki, a research associate here at CIPIT, with primary research focus on artificial intelligence and intellectual property law, keenly looking at the gaps that are being presented in the AI strategies and policies that are coming up within our continent. Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia. Josephine?
Yes, I hope I'm audible. As you've heard, my name is Josephine Kaniru. I also work here at CIPIT as a research associate, and I do research touching on data and AI governance, and also I assist with the IP policy and governance team. And my most recent research project, especially on the AI governance side, I've been looking at how we can strengthen inclusion for people with disabilities by looking at the laws and policies we have currently, being the recent People with Disabilities Act of 2025, and there's also some KEBS standards on accessibility that we're looking at. So we want to see whether all that is enabling inclusion or embedding marginalization for people with disabilities. Thanks.
Thank you, Jos. Last but not least, Irene.
Thank you so much. My name is Irene Makau. I'm also a research associate here at CIPIT, majorly in the AI and data governance department. My focus majorly has been on the curation stage of the AI ecosystems and ensuring that, ethical we have ethical AI outputs that emanate from the curation stage of the creation of the AI systems, which is majorly the data, how the data is collected, how data is generated, and how data workers are treated, and how that translates to the kind of AI outputs we get. And I'm happy to be here today.
Thank you so much, Irene. So that will be our panel today. I'm comprised of key CPIT researchers working on different areas of AI policy, governance, and understanding it as well. So to introduce myself, as I did not when we began, my name is Florence Ogonjo. I'm a research fellow here at CPIT under the AI policy team. Research focus predominantly looks at the wider development of wider AI policy governance structures, as well as looking at it from an African lens, as well as applying a human rights perspective to it. With that brief introduction, I will be your moderator for today. And just to set the scene in understanding what the context of this particular webinar is, the webinar description, I'm sure if you read it, it was quite long, but I'm sure if you read it, did a great job in sort of framing what the conversation is today. But to add on to it, it is more a key focus in terms of looking at the continental state of play, noting that there's quite a number of African countries that now have their national AI strategies or in the process of developing their national AI strategies. As it stands, national AI strategies in Africa are around 16. So that's showing us a continuous increase towards that. We have Uganda that is now also working on its national AI strategy within the East African community. And also noting that we already have the Continental AI strategy, of course, which set a substantial framing for what the AI trajectory in the African continent looks like. Building on that, looking at it from the perspective of whether the African continent can move from being mere consumers of AI technologies, but also creators and developers, so that we are moving with the track of AI in Africa, of looking at AI in Africa, so that we are framing it as, we always define it in CPIT as AI in Africa, built in Africa for Africans. So in looking at it from that perspective, we note that there's quite a number of grassroots NLP projects that are happening within the continent, some that are agri-tech facing, some that are education facing, some that are health facing, to be able to solve all AI projects that are generally structured in a way that is aiming to solve specific African needs and problems as and when they arise. Noting that, again, health, education, public service delivery are some of the key components within which, or other areas within which you're seeing AI being leveraged within the continent. So we are also trying to bring in a multidisciplinary approach in trying to understand how AI is being shaped in the continent, in that we are looking at data governance as an enabler and a fundamental building block for effective governance, which ensures that data generated in the continent remains under African control, fostering a sense of data sovereignty while protecting its citizens from AI-enabled surveillance, as well as other risks that come when we look at data. We are also looking at the critical role of intellectual property, as it is essential to ensuring that African communities benefit from their own contributions. We will note some governance innovations that have been targeted towards ensuring that there's benefits that go back to the community, and also trying to demonstrate how IP frameworks can protect culture and intellectual property rights innovations, as well as looking at more substantive IP concerns where it comes to dealing with things like algorithmic colonization. So that the past doesn't necessarily define what our technological future looks like. We will also have an opportunity to canvass a few opportunities vis-a-vis regulatory readiness, whether we can make the balance between innovation and regulation and policy, seeing as we are now at the stage where Kenya in and of itself is in the process of developing its national policy for AI and emerging technologies. We are also seeing the development of the national data governance framework. And within the wider East African region, we are seeing that there's country consultations that are ongoing with respect to the development of the East African Community AI strategy. So these particular elements that we are seeing continuously grow and develop towards how AI governance structures are being shaped within the continent, not just from a continental basis, but also looking at it from a regional perspective as well as national perspectives. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, one key thing that is always championed is ensuring that in as much as we are developing these policies, there is consideration for our own local context and the regulations that we need based on our own local situations and positionings with respect to how we are developing and leveraging artificial intelligence, as well as trying to ensure that our policies are grounded in a local first approach, meaning that they are intended to specifically address what each country is going through. And even with that, we're also seeing components of needing or requiring harmonization to be able to put those together. So trying to also explore whether those can be fitted together in terms of the core principles that we have that exist in terms of fairness, transparency, accountability, and seeing how those feed into key AI governance structures and policies as they are being developed. So with that in mind, I will go straight to allowing our researchers also canvas a few thematic areas in conversation, which will again at national AI governance structures in terms of institutional priorities and institutional readiness, and looking more strategically at continental coordination, regulatory harmonization, and looking at where our global stance is with respect to certain trends and strategic policy adaptations. And then looking at indigenous ethics as well, and looking at decoloniality to an extent, and knowledge on AI governance. And lastly, looking at participatory governance, data rights, and community involvement and participation when it comes to the development processes and how they fit into the whole cycle of the AI governance structures and development of AI policies. So with that, once again, I'd like to welcome those who are continuously joining us. Karibuni sana. And I will go right into the more structured conversations with respect to the scene that I have just set. So we'll begin with the very first component of it, which is looking at grounding us more or less in looking at governance from a national perspective. We start home, then we move out. Looking at what our immediate priorities are and our institutional design and capacity and readiness is, just noting that we are now in the process of developing key strategic frameworks that will build on AI governance structures. So to the panelists, to our very esteemed researchers, so I would like to more or less ask that, given that we are at varying stages of AI policy development across the continent, also noting that as a country, we are also at a different stage in comparison to other countries, yet we have certain global standards that have already been set. What would you say implementation of a comprehensive AI governance framework would look like, especially one that is tailored towards our local context, particularly through a multidisciplinary approach, which of course integrates intellectual property, other foundational laws, and data governance structures?
So you find that AI systems are usually, they cut across multiple and legal and regulatory domains. So it's starting off, it's very important to have a multi-sector collaboration that now brings different disciplinaries into formulating this framework. So ideally, it will be useful to involve data protection authorities. This will come in, especially when addressing privacy, data security, and lawful processing of training and deployment of data sets. We'll also look at other key stakeholders like competition regulators who will monitor the risks of market concentration, data monopolies, and also unfair algorithmic market practices. Another key office that will be important is also the IP offices that will clarify ownership of AI-generated outputs and also protect local data sets. We also have civil society or academia, which will provide human rights oversight and technical research support. Also the private sector to ensure that innovation realities and infrastructure gaps are also addressed. So the purpose of this will be mainly to co-design frameworks that balance innovation with rights protection and ethical safeguards that are rooted in the local and social realities. Another point I would look at it from is the issue of strengthening existing data protection authorities. Since you might find some AI systems rely on personal or behavioral data, the DPAs will be actually central in AI governance and implementation. So governments in such a situation, they should be involved in funding and also expanding the technical capacity of DPAs to handle especially high-risk AI systems and also enforce compliance. And also there's the need for training legal and regulatory staff on existing AI lifecycle risks, which include algorithmic transparency, automated decision making, and also impact assessment. Another key aspect will be to encourage regulatory sandboxes that will allow controlled AI testing while maintaining privacy safeguards. Lastly, training in terms of like courses, like speak have data protection course, basically educating people on these fundamentals, so that now they come up with either policies and frameworks, they already know from which angle they address each issue. Yeah.
So thank you so much for those contributions, Joshua. Just to mention that most of the times AI frameworks are playing catch up with technologies, because most of the times technologies are really moving fast and new risks that are very uncertain are coming up. And sometimes, if I can put it this way, we need real-time frameworks being formulated every time to be able to handle these risks. And just like Joshua said, it's my recommendation is for regulatory sandboxes that will be able to, at the same time, encourage innovation and also ensure that, ethical AI is developed and adopted in Africa. I will give an example with what Rwanda is doing with its banking sector, and also I've seen Zambia doing the same thing. They're adopting regulatory sandboxes, and what these sandboxes are, it's like where innovators or developers can be able to test and create their AI systems within a controlled space where regulators can be able to guide and offer support. And through these sandboxes, also other key stakeholders are engaged, such as the civil societies. But now the main questions remains: how do we, ensure ensure accountability in the midst of this kind of flexibility? Because sandboxes are very flexible in that the environment is very relaxed and people can try, or rather developers can try out their new AI systems. And there is need for accountability when we are trying these AI systems. And what I propose is encourage different stakeholders, such as civil societies, academia, to take part in these sandboxes, and also have public reporting on the outcome of these sandboxes. And these sandboxes do not even need just to be from a specific sector. For instance, in Kenya, we have one for the Capital Markets Authority. They can also be national or even cutting across the borders between different countries. For instance, I know there is the EcoBank one that allows banks to use their API program across, I think, around 33 countries. So those are things that will ensure that besides creating new AI systems, also there is respect to human rights, and the adoption of AI is very ethical. And again, there is the aspect of using what we already have, collaborating across the region and across the continent. We already have existing frameworks in place, such as the Africa AU, the Continental Strategy, and even the GDC, which is the Global Compact, which is a global digital compact for Africa. They set pace, they set the minimum principles that we need to adopt for Africa when we are building AI systems. So starting from that point will ensure that countries do not come up with national AI strategies that are very fragmented and running away from the key principles that we have in those strategies. Yes.
I could add something brief. In addition to what Joshua mentioned, I think Joshua's last point was on capacity. In all the research we've done, I think for the last couple of years, I think the one thing that kept coming up is, one, where we are in terms of skills and capacity for both innovation and governance, and what we need to do. So there's been a lot of initiatives to increase capacity. especially on the governance side. I feel like in the beginning, we were pointing out a lot of the gaps in skills in terms of innovation and developing AI tools and machine learning solutions. But I think recently I've been noticing a lot of focus on capacity in terms of governance. And someone said it very interestingly, where they said that a lot of AI governance and AI adoption and innovation and scaling and making sure that we get benefits from this technology relies on decision making. So if the people making decisions and the people determining the direction that we are going in, they actually give it a 1 year, in the next century. So if someone is determining the direction we are taking in terms of technology adoption in the next 100 years, and they don't understand this technology, then we will not be in the right direction, or we will be taking a lot of detours and course correcting a lot. So I can highlight one course, which is a partnership between the Kenya School of Government, the Side School of Business at Oxford, and I think another part, and UNESCO. And it's a very, very interesting course that I think is tailored for civil servants, so that people have a foundational understanding of AI, what is needed in terms of AI governance, what risks are we looking for, also how do you determine the strategy for your organization and for your department going forward. And I think that's really useful. And so I found that very, very interesting. So capacity for policymakers. Yeah, I think that's also an urgent action to take.
Yeah, thank you so much. As I was listening to my colleagues as well, I kept on thinking of how AI does not exist in a vacuum. And this is just to echo the points that have been stated, in that looking at the AI ecosystem from its development stage all the way to the output it presents, it interacts with different facets, data governance being one of them, intellectual property, and just other areas, human rights as well. Therefore, as Joshua pointed out, there is a need, even as we're thinking about the legal frameworks and the policies that surround AI and its implementation and the implementation of ethical AI. Again, this is just to echo what my colleagues have said. There is a need to go into the different parts that inform the AI ecosystem, not just look at AI as a standalone, but also consider and take into consideration every other part and every other facet. Kenya, I'd like to highlight intellectual property as a thing to really highly think about and consider, because from the beginning, when it comes to taking and putting together the data that is used to train AI, oftentimes you'll find it's copyrightable material that is used, copyrighted material, sorry, that is used to train these AI systems. And intellectual property concerns arise there to the outputs themselves that we have from generative AI and other areas of artificial intelligence. What are we saying about those, and what frameworks are we putting out to govern and even protect the outputs that we get? What conversations are we having around that? Because you will find, and maybe we'll get into this as we continue on with our discussions, you will find that many of our continental AI strategies speak of innovations and encourage and put together goals and targets to have AI innovations and all this, and have not thought through till the very end how then do we protect those innovations, and whether there are actually those structures and regulatory frameworks to protect those innovations. So again, as pointed out by my colleagues, it is of value, even as we're thinking about implementation, to take into consideration all the other facets that make the AI ecosystem what it is, and how we can also have all those feed into ethical AI.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. So from all the responses that you've all ably given, I'm seeing elements of institutional capacity coming up in terms of preparations for either AI policy, adaptation of AI policy, or just the foundational knowledge with respect to understanding AI. This specifically coming from a government perspective, where we're having training of public servants. Even in Kenya, I think there is a program that was rolled out last year to train public servants at the Kenya School of Government with respect to that. So in terms of building institutional capacity, of those who will be offering public services and the areas in which it will be AI is likely to be leveraged, which in this case is government and public services. We're also seeing elements come up in terms of strengthening already existing laws and ensuring that those existing laws are also considered within the context of how we are looking at developing our own AI governance structures and considering whether they are robust enough and the layers within which they are being created are substantive. Also, tests in terms of putting across the regulatory sandboxes that we are seeing also coming up. So there's also, other than the more technical regulatory sandboxes, we're also seeing an increase in championing for policy regulatory sandboxes as well. So before we move on to the next set of discussions, I want to put a poll up just to gauge the participants' view in terms of how we are looking at AI governance and to get their perspective on how they're looking at AI governance. So there's a poll that should come up on your screen. Okay, at 80% participation, I'd say that's pretty good. So I think the poll can end and we can share the responses. We're seeing a really small number with respect to formal AI strategy policy discussions. There are those of you who are not sure, which is ideally understandable, and I hope this session will help you get a bit of understanding maybe, or be curious enough to check. So in most, the one with the most is noting that there's national AI strategy adopted, but not yet implemented. I would gauge that a big majority of these are from Kenya, with other African countries represented as well. So we have national AI strategies. Implementation is still something that's quite pending. Some are on early stages of working on a draft framework, which is in progress, which is good. So we are seeing a bit of a balance between countries that have right now are intentionally in the process of starting to build their AI governance structures, either through national AI strategies, also already existing foundational laws such as your data protection and data governance frameworks, and some who are still at the early stages, which is ideally what we have noted across the board for the African continent. So thank you so much for participating in the poll. So the discussion with our panelists ideally was to be phrased in terms of how would you say African nations would effectively leverage existing regulatory authorities? Also in terms of looking at it from a continental perspective, where we have the African Union being able to strengthen its role in unifying fragmented AI governance approaches across the continent, particularly by fostering regulatory harmonization across, again, the multidisciplinary context within which AI governance sits and exists, which is data governance, cross-border data, looking at cross-border data flows, again, innovation and IP coming up, and navigating other institutional capacity constraints. Also keeping in mind the human rights perspective of it and maybe political will, so to speak, among member states.
I can start on that. So we already have foundational laws. We have, I think by last year we had mapped at least 45 African countries that had binding data protection laws. We have quite a bit of IP governance frameworks. We have, digital trade laws. We have digital health laws. So we have a lot of foundational laws that we can rely on currently. The gap at the African level or at the regional level is that most of these laws, if not all, are very fragmented. And so each is speaking its own language. And I think Irene mentioned earlier, regulatory sandboxes. So we have the laws, the foundational laws, we have standards, and we have maybe sandboxes and other governance frameworks. All these do not speak to each other. In terms of the laws, how this affects maybe innovation, say at an African or regional level, is that a lot of, I was doing some research on how SMEs are experiencing this fragmentation, and I realized that a lot of this, the impact of this fragmentation is that a lot of SMEs are very reluctant to scale beyond their local context because they don't know what compliance mechanisms are required, especially in the context of cross-border data flows. There's a lot of uncertainty, and so that leads to a lot of hesitance and also it's a it's a money question. It takes money to actually comply with a lot of these laws. I've been following even just the data protection compliance processes within Kenya, and I'm realizing that takes money, that takes strategy, that takes actually allocating a budget to even train your team on data protection. And so that's one of the challenges. On regulatory sandboxes, what I found as the challenge, I think last year there was a report released by DataSphere initiative that's called Africa Sandbox Outlook, and they were saying that 99% of the sandboxes we are seeing, even if we keep advocating for this as a mechanism for AI governance and data governance, 99% of them are national. And so if it's implemented in Rwanda or in Zambia or in Kenya, as Irene was mentioning, then it only applies in Kenya or Rwanda or Zambia. And there's no mutual recognition agreements or frameworks. Really, there's no even flow where we can build up on some form of mutual recognition to make sure that we are not duplicating efforts and having to do the same sandbox in a different country, and yet most of our contexts are really similar. That's the other area that I've seen a lot of fragmentation. The other one is in terms of standards. The research I was doing in SMEs, I realized that most of these standards and standardizations, even for individuals, even in our field, we see a lot of certifications for maybe data privacy practitioner and AI practitioner. A lot of these certifications and standardization mechanisms are, in fact, I don't know of any that's local, right? So even there's one I saw for DPOs, that's data protection officers, and then it still requires a global, meaning a European or American institution to certify this person as a practitioner. So that's also introducing some fragmentation in that we don't have, say, an African unified way to certify this is someone who can practice, data privacy or data governance or AI governance on the continent. The solution to this, or how we can achieve some form of harmonization, I'll start with Resolution 473, which is the resolution of the African Union it was on AI, new and emerging technologies in 2021. And part of that resolution, other than advocating for countries to create good AI governance mechanisms, the final point of that resolution was that they were going to conduct a study on AI, new and emerging AI, robotics, new and emerging technologies, and how to ethically and responsibly adopt that on the African continent. This study was published last year by the African Commission, last year May, and as I was looking at this study, I was trying to identify what's new thing that it's saying that we've not had, because there's a lot of documents, at the global level, also at the African level, there's a lot of documents. Most of them say the same thing in terms of the principles we are adopting. But what I found very interesting about this study is that they pointed out that this thing that we keep saying about bias mitigation does not actually meet the threshold, the threshold of human rights language around bias. So if you look at the African Charter and even the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, all these international frameworks and even local national constitutions, when they talk about discrimination, they don't just say, attempt to mitigate bias. They actually place obligations on states to eradicate biases. And so the study was saying that, bias mitigation, just that language is not enough actually to place any obligation on developers and companies and deployers of AI to mitigate bias. But just to take us back, so that resolution, I think I would point as the first attempt to harmonize at least, principles on how we can govern AI, and that study that resulted from it. The other thing I would point out is, the AU AI strategy, the Continental AI strategy, and the data policy frameworks, all those documents, the Agenda 2063, all those documents really point to, and I think they introduced or at least codified the African-centered language that we are currently using. So what I noticed is that in the earlier years of a lot of this data governance research and AI governance research, we kept saying that, most of the frameworks that we're reading, they don't speak our language, they don't sound African, they don't recognize us. And so there was a lot of intention to codify Afrocentric language. And so all those documents you notice are the ones that have inspired what we are doing now, a lot of what we are doing now, which is even as we develop the governance frameworks, we are making sure that they speak our language, they look at our contexts, and we are looking at our development needs in establishing governance frameworks. The other thing that I can point to, so I'll go back to the study, the African Commission, African Union Commission on Peoples and Human Rights study that was released last year. And something else I noted in terms of creating a harmonized framework that we can all sort of rely on moving forward. And they recommended that we apply the UNFCCC framework. So there's the UN framework convention on climate change, and how that convention is structured, it allows for protocols to be negotiated, later in later years to address emerging challenges. So we can refer to the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement. All these are climate change protocols that address very specific challenges. And so the study was recommending that at the African Union level, we can have such a framework convention that then can allow us to develop protocols as challenges emerge, especially because, as our earlier speakers were mentioning, technology moves very fast. Even, last year I had someone say how a lot of the research we were doing about AI governance could not address most of the actual AI use and AI application and use cases that we were seeing. So how can we sort of have agility in our laws is by having a framework convention at the African Union level, which sort of harmonizes, the mission moving forward, and then we can have protocols that then can address specific challenges. A final thing that I can point to is the African Union, the AFCFTA digital trade protocol. And that's just as a tool for harmonization, because also as I was doing research on this, I realized the AFCFTA has more buy-in among African governments than, say, the what do you call it? The Malabo Convention, the African Union Convention on Cybersecurity and Personal Data Protection. So that only got 15 ratifications, I think, in 2023, and it had been, released, say, 10 years earlier or something like that. So there's really not much discussion on the Malabo Convention. There's not much adoption. There's not much political will around it. And if you compare that to the AFCFTA, I think because of the economic nature of the AFCFTA and the trade implications, that has more buy-in. And so if we would want to harmonize data governance, especially in the context of trade, then I think that's a place where we can look at the digital trade protocol and the whole AFCFTA framework to just embed harmonized or interoperable either principles or guidelines at that level. Just to conclude on the study that the African Union Commission did, the next step in that process is to develop and release guidelines at that level, then which can guide, ongoing governance framework that we continue to develop. So I think that, those and other ways, are the ones that we can adopt, at least at this stage, to have some form of harmonization, because we actually have no choice but to harmonize as Africa, because it's even easier to take advantage and to recolonize Africa if there's no harmonized governance frameworks. It's easier for a country from somewhere else to just come and say extract your data and sort of determine your governance frameworks if you're not part of a harmonized African Union framework. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you so much for those insights, Joss. And I'm sure the participants agree with those reflections as well, seeing by the reactions that we are going with, and the need for us to sincerely consider harmonization, and in terms of it increasing our foothold and footprint within the global AI ecosystem. So with respect to that, I will move to the other discussions that substantively look at our own setting within our global, more substantively our global footprint, and looking at the element of ethics and decoloniality and what knowledge we have with respect to governance. So so the question here is, how can indigenous ethical systems such as Ubuntu be practically integrated into African AI policy systems and design and moves beyond Western-centric governance models? I think to an extent, Joss, you've also touched on this, and looking at it from the perspective where it particularly shapes data governance practices, intellectual property regimes, and develops accountability mechanisms to enable community-centered innovation. I think this goes hand in hand in segueing or adding from what Joss's reflections have been, as well as a question that one of the panelists also raised within the continent in terms of looking at ethics and embedding of that within the considerations for how we are looking at it from an African context. So any of the panelists can go ahead and begin their responses.
Again, this again is to echo what Justin mentioned, highlighted, where there is a need to have our voice in this in the discussions when it comes to AI, talking about AI regulation, talking about AI governance and ethical AI, again from an African lens. When we started this this webinar, Florence, you highlighted and defined what African AI means. And here at CPIT, we define African AI as AI developed in Africa by Africans for Africans. And as such, with that definition in mind, it would be of value because the frameworks are coming from us. It would be of value to take into high consideration. You mentioned principles of Ubuntu and other principles and standards that cut across many of our African states and nations, to take those into consideration as we are building and putting together our regulatory frameworks when it comes to thinking about artificial intelligence. At this point, I'd like to give an example of one way within which I would say we have considered an African approach when it comes to thinking about the AI ecosystem and implementation of African principles. And this is the Nolite Obodo data open data license. This is a data license that can be used by dataset owners to share their datasets with people who need it for the development of AI. And the unique thing about this this particular license is that it took an African approach and an African principles, took into consideration African principles in that it appreciated the community element and the community aspect, and how, in as much as, yes, we are taking data from communities, from indigenous communities, there is a need for them to share in the benefits of the same. As such, this is a license that, with that in mind, then it took a tiered approach in that it took into consideration the geography of data set creators and those who require this data set. It took into account the community sharing and benefit sharing, aspect of things, and how contributions and developments and any the word I'm looking for here is any commercial benefits can come back to the communities from which, for instance, language was taken from to develop a language processing AI system. And this is one way that we can start thinking about implementing African principles and ways of thinking, even as we think about our regulations and even as we think about the frameworks that we are building for our AI systems.
Moving on to looking at the decoloniality of it, and feeding from what Cynthia has said in terms of looking at ethical principles, the different perspectives that come out when we look at the data that is being leveraged, especially African data that is being leveraged for the development of different AI systems and AI tools. So with respect to that, what specific technical, regulatory, and policy measures do you see can be implemented to mitigate some of the risks that come with leveraging data, especially African data, such as algorithmic bias in AI systems, especially when it comes to concerning African data sets, as well as our substantive African knowledge systems.
So from the data governance perspective, we find that mitigating algorithmic bias in AI systems, especially for these African language data sets, centers mostly on how that data is collected, how it's processed, governed, and also safeguarded throughout the AI life cycle. So bias might emerge probably because of poor quality, underrepresentation, or unlawfully processed data. So it's important to strengthen data protection frameworks that directly reduce this bias risk. So one a solution that might be key or a measure is ensure the lawful, fair, and transparent collection of data. So it's important to ensure that these data sets that are used to train these AI systems comply with core data protection principles. And these include the principles of lawfulness, fairness, transparency, and also purpose limitation. So where the African language datasets involve especially identifiable individuals, for instance, voice recordings or conversational datasets, informed consent or any other lawful basis should be established before this is actually collected. Also, regulators have a key aspect or role to play here. So they should discourage the bulk scraping of this local language content without any safeguards, as this will also result in probably distorted dialectical representation or cultural representation. Another thing is to ensure that there's the issue of data quality and also representative obligations. So data protection regime should actually ensure that this data that's collected is accurate and relevant to meet the requirements of AI training datasets. Also, regulators can require documentation that shows that indeed to illustrate whether there are data set limitations, and also any known bias risks. Another thing will be to the compliance of data minimization and purpose limitation principle. So the AI developers mostly should only collect necessary data that's required for model training. And while doing that, they should also ensure that the data they collect is for the purpose which was intended, and it's not more than what was intended for doing a specific purpose. This is to ensure that once this is collected, it's not misused beyond the initial purpose that was supposed to have been fulfilled. Another thing from a data governance perspective, it will be to ensure that especially from regional perspective, that cross-border data transfer rules ensure that data sets that are exported for training AI systems are used lawfully. And one way they can do this is to ensure that there are data sharing agreements that specify the permitted uses of data sets, also restrict any onward transfers, and finally require dataset documentation. So I think from a data governance perspective, I might point out this. Another thing would be probably a data protection impact assessment to be conducted in order to reduce any risks that might be observed for any biometric data that might be collected or voice data that might be collected. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Just to add on to what Joshua has said, when we think about algorithm biases, the first question should be, what are the causes of these algorithm biases? Where are they emanating from? And algorithm biases are not, they are a creation of the data. The data that is fed into the systems and used to train these algorithms is what really causes these biases. And this is not to say that data is the only cause of biases, because also human beings are a very critical cause of biases. Humans are biased, and also the kind of data labeling or training that is done to these algorithms also affects the kind of biases the algorithms are going to pick from it. So key to ensuring that there is algorithm transparency is adopting, ethical data generation and collection mechanisms, just like Joshua put it, and especially for data generation, because most of the times generation, or rather collection of data for training AI models, is from the web. And this means that if there are people who are not online, there are people whose data is not represented online. Then when this data is scraped, their data is not collected, or rather their culture is lost because no data is to represent them is collected. And to ensure that this problem of misrepresentation and underrepresentation is cut out, it goes back to the aspects around who are these people who are online, who are these people who have access to mobile phones, who are these people who are able to generate content online, the same content that is also used to train AI models. And so we have seen certain things that some communities are doing. For example, the Masakane Research Foundation, which is ensuring that African voices are represented in African voices and their cultures are represented in natural language processing systems. And again, just to echo what Joshua said, there are already existing regulatory and enforcement bodies that are already existing that can help when it comes to algorithm biases. I'll talk about the competition authorities that exist in place. We have seen in South Africa, for instance, Meta and Google have already been fined on issues around lack of algorithm transparency and accountability. For instance, I think for Google, what happened is that the algorithm was only picking global news for their search engine, and it wasn't picking any news from the local publishers. And what that meant is that the local publishers were not getting traction, and hence they were not getting any revenue. And we saw that the South African's competition authority came in handy in that. So we can also leverage on existing authorities such as competition authorities to avoid algorithm collusions and algorithm monopolies and lack of transparency and accountability. In addition to that, the Kenyan Data Protection Act also has a provision around transparency and accountability when it comes to some of the data protection principles. One of them is transparency and accountability. When we are adopting systems and we are allowing systems to be used in our countries, do we look at the accountability and transparency in the algorithms that are wired in these systems? Do we conduct audits in these algorithms to just ensure that they are not perpetuating biases? And just after the audits, do we have humans in the loop just in case people complain that these algorithms are causing biases? Or are we going to have responses from the same robots or from the same systems that are creating biases to respond to us? So those are things we can look into, just leverage on the existing data protection principles, leverage on existing authorities such as the competition authorities, conduct algorithm audits, and also to develop our own infrastructure where our own African voices and culture data are collected and stored, document data about us so that we do not end up being misrepresented in the AI systems that are created, because most of these systems are created in the West.
Thank you so much for those insights, Irene, and deliberating on the fact that we already have some foundational laws and existing frameworks that carry specific principles that can be able to address these risks, and just ensuring that the same are looked at from more of an AI perspective based on how we are collecting our data, using that data, especially for the development of AI tools and systems. So with that, I want to put up another poll just to make sure that the participants are still with us, in terms of just the reflections that we've already made, and in terms of what ideally the participants would think they'd like to see in terms of being priority in AI policy. I think we can close the poll. So we are seeing that what most people would like to see in terms of AI policy right now is data governance and infrastructure. That's the first leading one, followed closely by ethical standards and accountability mechanisms. Then we have protection of human rights and civil liberties. Then we have AI skills and capacity building. Then, of course, we have AI skills and capacity building almost tying with public sector AI regulation, or rather public sector AI regulation in terms of justice, health, and education, moving closely together with the protection of the AI skills and capacity building, I mean. And so those are great insights to see, and I think they're continuously reflective of the direction within which some of our policies are also going. So for data governance and infrastructure, we are seeing that with the development of the National Data Governance Policy Framework. with respect to ethical standards and accountability mechanisms. Those ones we are seeing reflected particularly in the national AI strategy with the principles that it entails to leverage, as well as with the development of the national AI and emerging technologies policy that is also in the process of being developed. And then in terms of public sector AI regulation, we are seeing some sectors like the judiciary. I know in sometime last year, I think it opened up the public comments for its AI adoption policy framework. So we are seeing that it's something in the works as well. And we're also seeing it in terms of AI and capacity building, which we have already ideally noted through that different initiatives that are already ongoing from government perspectives and from a wider international organization perspective, partnering with national governments in terms of training the staff with respect to artificial intelligence. So I'm seeing those are the key areas in which we are seeing it, and they're already being reflected throughout the conversations that we are having as well. So to ask the last set of discussion questions, and then we can move directly into the Q&A session. So as we complete these discussions, which I think we can have them in different capacities and parameters, we look at it now from maybe a stakeholder perspective, because when Joshua was beginning, he also mentioned the importance of having multiple stakeholders involved in the process. So the question is, how can stakeholder engagement, including community participation, which we have seen to be very important, civil society involvement, local knowledge holders as well, be meaningfully integrated into AI policy making processes in Africa to ensure governance frameworks are transparent, inclusive, and that they are more holistic in terms of exploring elements that are also community-centered, in terms of looking at data governance, elements of intellectual property, and within the wider scope of looking at building AI governance structures and shaping what AI policy would ideally look like.
The earlier question was something on decoloniality, and I really wanted to say something on that. So I'll answer this question maybe at that level, and I'll set the stage, to answer your earlier question on how we can ensure that we are rejecting the colonial patterns in this age. And I was reading somewhere, and someone was comparing how the UK took over India to how some two global powers are currently sort of in charge of the whole AI stack. So the UK had the railway, the railway system. They had the telegraph. I couldn't even tell you how telegraph used to operate, but I imagine it was some communication system. And so because of that, they were able to reach, the farthest areas of India. They were able to establish a decentralized governance system that enabled them to take over India and just shatter their industries, and then they rendered them providers of raw materials and like literally a forced market. So, before that, the people in India, there used to be artisans who would make cloth using silk and cotton, and then they would sell to even internationally. But when the British, with their superior technology came, they took over the artisans' business, and now people in India, they had to give the raw materials to Britain, and then they had to actually buy the product from them. That obviously happened a lot in the global south, Kenya included, and a lot of Anglophone African countries included. How that's being replicated today is literally just like that. So that, whoever they is extracting a lot of data, extracting a lot of data labor and data labeling and annotation labor and AI labor and skills, and also extracting data. And then we are a forced market. A lot of the AI tools that even Kenya is ranked as among the top users really do not originate from Kenya, although a lot of the labor that went into making and training these tools actually originated from Kenya and other African countries. How I've seen this being solved, and I think now this is why I bring in stakeholder engagement. I've seen a lot of collaboration among global South countries, and I'll highlight the India AI Impact Summit. I think it was ongoing last week or this week. And in some of the pre-summit events that CPIT was was involved in or was engaged in, it sounded like the intention is to make sure that there's global south to south collaboration, both at the innovation and at the governance, in innovation around AI and governance of AI, so that we don't replicate, the thing about having to buy clothes and yet we have, the cotton and the silk. So there's a lot of that collaboration, and I think at that level, that's stakeholder engagement that I've really admired, and I think that's going to be impactful. Just to give an example of how this is actually very useful, someone at one of these pre-summit events, someone was pointing out that, when the AI impact summits and AI summits around the world started to happen, there used to be, at the first one, there was one African in the room. At the second one, there was, say, 3 Africans in the room. But, if you compare with the India one, then there's very many Africans in the room. And so if you're, in the room, then you're able to actually determine the decisions, and you're able to determine the direction, and you're able to have some sort of sovereignty. But if, considering the capacity gaps that we have, that's not easy, but at least being in the room then allows you to, to determine the direction that AI governance and AI innovation and adoption is going to take. Yeah, thanks.
All right. I'll try to answer it from the first bit of the question. So I think one way to increase stakeholder engagement, especially, will be to incorporate, especially local communities or local norms, and also consent mechanisms. So you find, especially like in African countries, you find that issues like languages and traditional knowledge and cultural expressions are not really individually owned, and they are usually a collective and communal ownership aspect. So this usually means that relying on standard individual consent models may be also insufficient. So it's very important to involve the local community so that they can help identify especially which types of data that might be culturally sensitive, so that when coming up with either the AI policy making processes, you can know what they might be viewed as sensitive information. And also, while doing this, it's important to also comply with existing regulations. For instance, you find like in Kenya, we have the traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expressions legislation, which also recognizes collective community rights rather than just individual consent. So consent processes for data derived from this, from traditional knowledge or cultural expressions, should actually be made in such a way that they comply with already existing legislations. Another thing would be to especially strengthen the oversight and accountability. So civil society plays especially a crucial role since they advocate for transparency, fairness, and also accountability in ensuring that AI technologies work well. So their participation also provides oversight and reduce the risk of misuse or unauthorized access to data. And their role is key in ensuring that free, prior, and informed consent is obtained. So we can't really, civil society plays a key role in this. And also, there's the need to include diverse stakeholders that ensure that the governance frameworks that are being put in place account for all affected groups, especially the marginalized or also any data vulnerable communities. You might find also refugees and all that. So this will also play a key role, especially in the AI policy making process.
My response will be brief. I think beyond seeing what the regulators can do, there is also a charge and a call for those who use this same products that come from AI and this AI systems impact. They too need to have a proactivity in themselves to come and give information. The thing that we often see is that when we think about policy, when we think about regulation, the people it affects and those stakeholders are often considered at the end of that process, of the regulation making process. But there is also a charge and a call for the people it affects to have that in them, to know that they too need to participate in this, in the discussions that again inform the regulations that will then also inform how AI is built, how AI is protected, how AI, like all these different facets, they will come back and in turn affect these same stakeholders. So there's also a charge for them. It's not always that they need to be called upon. They too can come and share.
I think for me, I can briefly talk to capacity building, because for some people, when stakeholder engagements are taking place, they are excluded by design just because they do not have access to this information for them to be able to participate in these engagements. And so it's very critical that we also ensure that we educate everybody, especially people from undeserved communities and the rural communities, so that they are able to, understand the conversations that are ongoing, and they are also able to participate either through community-led initiatives or through CSOs.
As I was saying, the examples I can give is in the development of the national AI strategy and the resulting documents. That's the data governance policy and the AI and emerging technologies policy. Those are ongoing processes. And I think CPIT has been heavily involved in most of these processes. And what I noted is there was actually intentional engagement of different stakeholders. So, for instance, the ongoing AI and emerging technologies policy development that's ongoing, I was able to be in the room when the stakeholders from the media ecosystem were being, asked for their input, and I found that very interesting. And actually, even if that was not, that's not my cluster, then I was really grateful to hear from the media, because I don't get to interact, I guess, a lot with people from that sector. And what I noted is, if we have everyone in the room, we actually also are able to assign roles, because other than just entitlement that we have or we need or we demand from these policies, there's actually roles and responsibilities. So, for example, the media was tasked, or there were discussions around how the main task of the media is actually to act as educators and the disseminators of these skills that we are talking about. So I think through those processes and many other policy development processes, I've noted there's intention to have different voices in the room. And I think the benefit is that it's not just about entitlement and rights, but we also get to assign roles. Everyone has something they can contribute. And I think, that's been very insightful for me to note.
Thank you so much, Joss, and thank you to all the panelists for all the insights you've given throughout the conversation. I think you've also enabled the participants sort of have key reflections with respect to the conversations that we're having, which has only brought out more clearly how sort of layered shaping AI governance structures and shaping AI policy is across different disciplines, be it from a human rights perspective, looking at it in terms of intellectual property, looking at it in terms of data governance and how those sort of overlap, and then bringing in the context or component of participatory governance, where we are intentionally looking towards involving communities and living up to the local first approach in terms of developing the governance structures. Also bringing in elements of decoloniality and moving away from elements and standards that ideally would be Western-centric, and trying to develop policies that are grounded within the African context, and more specifically sometimes within regional context, which brings in elements that sort of harmonize all of us together in terms of looking at how our governance structures are actually being built. So with that, I think we move to Q&A. I've seen quite a number of questions. Some I think have been answered, but correct me if I'm wrong. And some have been reflections, but I will begin with the very last question that has been asked. So we begin with Anonymous, who asks, how can African states develop a context-specific AI governance framework that balances innovation, data sovereignty, and social economic development while safeguarding human rights, transparency, and accountability? I will leave this open for any of the panelists to answer.
Okay, yeah, so I can briefly answer that. So how can African states develop, so context specific. So as I mentioned earlier, there's ongoing processes to develop a national data governance policy and a national AI and emerging technologies policy framework. And I think Florence also mentioned that the judiciary is developing an AI adoption framework. So these are all instruments or documents that govern how we are adopting AI. How to make sure they are context specific. As I was listening to discussions around the AI and emerging technologies policy, the researchers in that team indicated that they actually conducted benchmarking, and even on the other side, the data governance policy, there's a lot of benchmarking, from countries that have established these frameworks and these policies. But now, after doing that, they have to actually make sure that it's context specific. So I think to Anonymous, I'm going to answer your question by saying that how they develop a context specific AI governance framework is actually just by doing it. So, in past maybe legal or law-making processes, we would take a law and take it as it is and just adopt it and make it ours. But I've seen genuinely a lot of intention to make sure that we consider the context, the local context, our local development needs. So if you look at the national AI strategy, for example, you see it really is addressing Kenyan sectors that are adopting AI. It's addressing actual, what's ongoing in Kenya before sort of setting the direction. So I think how we do it is just by doing it.
Thank you, Joss. You reminded me of something that we mentioned during last year's conference on the state of AI in Africa. He mentioned something in relation to the context of there's no one who's coming to save us, and that it's up to us from our national perspectives as well as continental perspectives to take up the mantle of developing laws that are context specific to us, and especially ensuring that, of course, the stakeholder component of it comes in, and developmental context of it come in, and we also considering the socioeconomic context within it. So it's a broader web that requires intentionality, I think, from the state in itself and then the continent in itself. So thank you so much, Joss. I will read a reflection from Stanley, who says it's been a great initiative on integrating African data in developing ML-based AI systems to include African languages in digital systems. Interesting and nuanced perspectives and questions from the panelists on the topic, as well as fellow participants. So he mentions that cultural representation is key. The tiered approach is effective and can attest to being a member of the Coalition on Digital Impact Inaugural Working Group, defining minimum viable data sets for cultural and linguistic empowerment towards an equitable cultural and linguistic representation of indigenous African languages and participation in today's digital AI-driven world. So ethics is key to the process. Also, I think Stanley's example and what he's involved in with respect to the working group, I think is also one example of how we are building towards those particular structures, making sure it is participatory inclined, making sure that we are considering our elements from our own local context, especially with respect to data sets and African languages. So I think that's quite significant and quite important. Thank you so much for those reflections. So I will look at the last questions that asks, how can AI governance frameworks in Africa, how can governance frameworks in Africa balance surveillance and public security concerns while establishing strong accountability mechanisms to regulate foreign technology companies deploying AI systems in African markets? I think we can have either Joshua, Irene, Joss, or Cynthia answer the same, either from an AI governance perspective or more specifically from a data governance perspective. I can also so I will answer it with respect to noting that key to surveillance mechanisms has been ensuring one, constitutional mandates with respect to the protection of the right to privacy are adhered to, and then building up on the fact that we now have the Data Protection Act. Those two have been quite significant in trying to establish the fact that we have specific governance mechanisms that would protect against things like surveillance. However, notably, the element of surveillance has been a quite weighty issue, noting that governments tend to use surveillance not for the purpose in which it is intended, but sometimes disproportionately, as well as through using surveillance mechanisms. During we have seen these come up during elections in different countries, especially within the African continent, and these have been quite apparent. So in as much as we have the Malabo Convention and our data protection laws, which I always perceive them as foundational laws and foundational mechanisms that do protect our particularized data, which would ideally be processed through surveillance, as well as the Constitution that embeds this. And then we have the African Charter on the African Convention on the Protection of Humans and People's Rights as well, speaks quite distinctively with respect to some of these parameters. I think they already exist. So the how of it, the laws already exist, I would say. The how of which depends on implementation parameters and oversight mechanisms as well, which is something that has been noted to be slightly poorer in some countries, while some countries tend to be a bit more stringent with them, which is why I say sometimes elements of civil society being involved in speaking out on some of these elements becomes also key, especially when it comes to how public data is being collected, how public data is being shared. How do those fall within the parameters of data protection? And our data protection laws being implemented by our own governments who hold a majority of the data that we have. So that would be my input on it. I additionally will share a report that CIPID did on unveiling privacy and surveillance in the age of AI that we did. So it would also give quite a bit of insight on the same, but I'll have Joshua continue with the rest if he's ready for his response.
All right, I think Florence, have covered most of the part of the question. I'll say it will be important, especially to especially clearly define the purpose and also the limits that AI surveillance might reach. So just because there's surveillance AI systems are readily available, it should also comply with existing data protection laws and also any other laws that are important. Also, there's the need to classify uses based on either intrusiveness and also impact, like high risk uses, especially when it comes to facial use of these AI systems. And there's need for authorization when faced with such issues. I think next to be especially the need for embedding privacy by design, which is a key data protection aspect, data governance. And they should minimize also data collection or anonymize or pseudonymize any data that they come across. So I think from a data governance aspect, I might think of that. Yeah, don't have any addition.
Thank you so much for those insights, Joshua. I think we are now officially out of time. I mean, these conversations can go on and on and on, but I'd like for us to stop here and maybe we can catch up during the next AI governance webinar series to sort of have more substantive conversations and discussions on the same. So I'd like to extend my gratitude to all the participants who've been here up until now. Thank you for always attending our webinar sessions as and when they do come up. Like I said, I've been seeing quite a number of familiar faces, which I'm always happy to see. So welcome again and again and again. And from those who are from different countries in Africa, I've seen Zimbabwe somewhere here. I think I've seen South Africa as well here. Thank you so much for attending and creating the time for this. We really appreciate it. Special thanks to our core researchers here at CIPID for doing an amazing job. Joshua, Josephine, Cynthia, Nzuki, and Irene, thank you so much. I'm sure you'll be able to interact with some of them during different events as and when they come up in the course of the year. So with that, thank you, and I wish you an amazing afternoon and evening, depending on where you are, and see you at the next webinar series, which should be at the end of the month of March. So be on the lookout for that. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.